Plants use various elements to carry out their day-to-day processes and make things like sugars and proteins and all the various things we've been talking about in this class so far. And to get the elements that they need to take them up from the soil predominantly. To do that, the nutrients can come into the plant in one of two ways. We can have just plain old bulk flow uptake. If you recall, bulk flow is the movement of water directly into the xylem of the roots, bypassing all the membranes, and this allows for anything and everything that happens to be dissolved in that water to move directly into the plant. But the majority of the root system uptakes water through osmosis, which basically prevents the movement of nutrients into the roots because these cells have cell membranes, which, if you recall, are selectively permeable. And so the nutrients themselves, or the elements or ions dissolved in the soil water, have to have some means of getting across a membrane at some point for a root hair, let's say, to uptake them in the first place. So let's put together a little drawing of what I'm talking about here. This, we'll say, depicts a cell membrane of a root hair. Okay. Cell membrane. And we'll say on this side of the membrane is a root hair cell. And out here is the soil solution, which just means soil, water, and everything that happens to be dissolved in it. All right, in the case of, let's say, higher hypothetical element A, we may have lots of A floating around out here in the soil. We may have much more A floating around in the soil solution than we do in the interior of the cell. And so in the case of A, let's say we've got a gradient that's from low or from high out here in the soil for A to low inside of the root hair cell. Now, again, plain old diffusion makes these A ions, let's say, want to move into the interior of the root, but because we have a cell membrane that is selectively permeable, they cannot. They can't just go across a membrane. They have to somehow be allowed to come through the membrane. And there are various types of proteins and other things embedded in a cell membrane. And I'm going to draw one in right here. Okay. And we're going to call this a protein channel or an ion channel. And it is indeed made out of protein. It allows certain ions to pass. We can sort of think of it as a little pipe or a little culvert opening that allows certain things to flow through it. Now, if this protein channel is shaped specifically, and they are very, very specific for certain ions, if it's specifically shaped to channel ions of the type A, well then, if we have a gradient, A will move along its gradient through one of these protein channels, okay, and into the interior of the cell. So basically, it's a little pipeline for the movement of these ions from the soil, water, directly into a cell. Now, in order for this to work, we have to have a gradient. And so this is referred to as passive transport. And the key is it has to move along the gradient, and you have to have the correct protein channel in place. If we had an additional ion out here, ion X will not fit through this protein channel. If the plant needs this particular ion X, how's it going to get it? That's where the second type of transport comes into play. Let's shift down here, and I'll continue my cell membrane down in this direction. And let me put something in here. Embedded in that cell membrane. I'll get into what that is in a few minutes here. Continuing our cell membrane, and again, remember this is, let's say this is our root hair cell, the interior of our root hair cell. And out here is our soil solution, which is just the water in the soil. And floating around in the soil solution is some of this nutrient, let's just call it again, nutrient X. And there's a few of them out there in the soil. Now inside of this root hair cell, there are, let's say, quite a few of these X nutrient ions, because that's what the plant's root hairs are in the business of doing, is uptaking lots of this stuff from the soil. And so if we look at the gradient here for X, our fictional nutrient here, it would be high on this side of the membrane, but out here in the soil, nutrient X would be low in terms of concentration. Now, if it were high out here and low inside, for this ion X to move through this membrane, we would simply need one of these protein channels, and we could just rely on passive transport to move it along the gradient like we just described. However, I've already said that that is not the case. So passive transport, even if we had the right protein channel, is not an option for nutrient X. And so the plant has to rely on what is referred to as active transport. Active transport, we'll say, can occur, it doesn't necessarily have to be, but it can and often is, against the gradient. Or we can kind of think of it as against gravity. And instead of calling this an ion channel or a protein channel, I'm going to call this a pump. And this pump is specific to element X. So it's a pump of type X for this particular nutrient. And just like a pump in a well to move water against gravity, it needs a power source. And that power source, provided by the root hair cell, is in the form of these guys. Remember ATP with my little explosion around it? ATP is produced from sugars. And so ATP is provided to this pump, which allows it to operate and actually pump nutrient X across the membrane against the gradient. But there is a cost. And so let's just say right here, this costs the cell some resources. Specifically, it costs the cell in terms of sugar to make this ATP stuff. So X being an essential nutrient, the plant has to have it in order to complete its life cycle. And so it's well worth the energy expended in terms of ATP and the sugar burned to make that ATP to move this nutrient X from the soil into the root hair cell. And it makes no difference if there's a gradient present in the favorable direction or not. That's the way this pump operates. It does not operate as a protein channel like we saw with passive transport. In active transport, it requires energy in the form of ATP.